Peter often described it as like we had a shorthand between each other, so we knew, I knew him quite well by that stage, having done Picnic, Hanging Rock, and then The Last Wave before Gallipoli. To be honest, when a cinematographer gets offered a film, he usually, or she usually either puts the priority with the director or the script. And so I read the script and I thought it was terrific. Read the script of Gallipoli and thought it was terrific, and I had no hesitation about saying I'd love to do it. I did agree with his vision. Peter Weir you're talking about. So his vision was to make, is to start the film off as an adventure, which it sort of was right up until the guys all turned up on Gallipoli Beach, Anzac Cove, which is now called. But the reality of actually fighting a war using live bullets and live ammunition became apparent to them as the moment they arrived on Gallipoli. So the early part of the foot racing that they were doing, where they Archie Hamilton won a prize. Mark Lee won the race, as you know, in the film. Then they ventured across to, I think they were going to Perth or Adelaide, I can't remember, to be honest, by train, and they woke up in this really bizarre place out in the middle of nowhere. Then they had to cross a salt lake, which was Lake Torrens in South Australia. And eventually they signed up to go to fight in Gallipoli for the Australian Light Horse. So it was an adventure story that turned into quite a strong statement about war and Australia's involvement in war, really. Although it was always a narrative, it wasn't a true story. It was based on Peter's impressions of war and stuff like that. So that's what that's what I was interested in pursuing in a film. Peter, I mentioned Peter a lot because obviously it's his film, but Peter likes to do a lot of research in pre-production, and a lot of that research is, for me particularly, is visual references, either from photographic books or paintings of the time, reading about the history, and looking at maps of Gallipoli where the film was set. A lot of the film was set, and part of the research also is to visit the locations that we chose to shoot the Anzac Cove and the Gallipoli escarpment, which was found in South Australia, out of about 40 minutes west of Port Lincoln, in South Australia. So my research really is just looking at the times, people, photographs, as I say, and some films. And so I'll try and get a picture in my head that will give me a clue as to how I should make the film look. And of course, it's all dependent on things like the locations, as I mentioned, the light, the historical accuracy, etc., etc. The first day of shooting, day one, I don't necessarily have an absolute image in my head or a style in my head, and that sort of evolves a little bit over the first few days until you get settled into the movie and the story. So consequently, by the end of the first week, you're definitely on a very straight path, hopefully a straight path. But it takes a little bit of time to actually there are things you can't achieve in pre-production until you actually pull the camera out of the box and start shooting. So that way, as I say, I don't have a clear, absolute line until after the first few days of the shoot, because it can vary a little bit too, with input from the art department, the camera operator, and obviously Peter. So it evolves really. The look of the film or the inspiration comes from the first few days on the set in a lot of ways. I felt the same, I still feel the same way about the film as it was when it was completed and now. It was a very important story to be told, even though it was a narrative, it was a fictional story, but it was about Australia coming of age in a lot of ways, young men coming of age and women, of course. And it sort of was a time when Australia was going through industrialisation. I mean, previously our whole economy was based on agriculture, but that was now the Australia was starting to get into manufacturing and all that sort of thing, and all that was very important, I think, for people to understand where Australia sat at the time, emotionally and maybe physically. So it was a very important period in Australia's coming of age, I thought. I still think. I think when the film was released, it had an impact on Australian audiences because they were of a generation that had probably even fathers or grandfathers in the Gallipoli campaign. It was released in '75, I think. So maybe grandfathers had fought in Gallipoli. But nowadays, the younger generation in Australia flock to Gallipoli every Anzac Day on April 25th because they feel it's part of their right to be part of it, to be Australian really in a lot of ways. So I think it definitely had a strong impact on Australians of a lot of different generations up to the present generation. Then and now it's definitely the same. The film definitely resonated with Australian audiences about the impending mortality of the story as well, because it was important. That was an important part of the end few scenes of the movie, or the impact of the whole ending of the movie was the fact that, you know, some of them were going to die, and it was no question of it. Films are sort of narrative stories, and they're about, you know, issues and people and emotions. I don't know whether you can really class a film as being Australian or Chinese or American or Hollywood or whatever. However, where they're made and where they're financed from, I think an Australian film to me would be one more on the financial side, where the investors are probably Australians, most of the crew are Australians, a lot of the actors are Australian, so I would probably call that an Australian film. But I don't think there really should be any borders, because it's a worldwide endeavour to make films anyway and tell stories. The whole atmosphere of the film Gallipoli was something that was close to my heart. I was born just right at the end of the Second World War, so I sort of came up with through a war-stricken country Australia was, really. I mean, even though there was no war in Australia, a lot of our armed forces went, and many of them died too in First and Second World War. So I think when I say it's probably my favourite Australian movie, or favourite movie that I've actually ever worked on, it would certainly be in that, right up there with them. But because of this, as I say, the story was so very close to my heart, really, that's why I put it up. I'm quite proud of it, to be honest. I do remember when we were shooting those nearly everybody was in tears on the set. Those scenes where the guys know they're going to have to go out over the trenches, and they're hanging up their watches on the trigger of a gun, or digging them into the sand in the side of the trench, knowing that, and letters to the girlfriends or parents or whatever. Incredibly emotional scene, which, you know, it's one of my favourite parts of the movie, is that whole sort of end story. So that's why I still love that film today, really.